And without any further ado, we have plenty of work to cover. So here we go. As I said before, tonight we're doing with the 8th lecture. And for those of you who weren't here in the past, God help you, because we're smack in the middle of the Yom Kippur War, which wasn't a cake run. It wasn't the 667 war. That's an easy one, relatively, to say over. Here we are on the night of October 16th, 1973. Last night of Chol Hamoed, the war started. The war started on Yom Kippur, obviously, and here we are almost a week later, actually more than a week later, the night of Chol Hamoed, the night before Shana Rabbah. This is the night that the Israelis begin to cross the Suez Canal. But it's not so simple, because how you cross the Suez Canal. Like I say, if you weren't here last week, I can't go over the whole business all over again. But the Israelis, they had their head handed to them in a lot of fights on the Sinai front. Every time they tried to attack over and over again the Egyptian position, they were badly beaten. I'll say it again, they're badly defeated. The Israeli army was repeatedly defeated in the first week of the war by the Egyptian army. Let's go over it and say it. But by the second week, they were looking to turn it around found a little hole in the Egyptian line and go through and cross the Suez Canal and go to the other side. But how do you do it? You need those doggone bridges, and Israel did not have bridges. They had these unifloat things, is what you use in harbors. None of the countries would sell Israel crossing bridge material between 1967 and 73, because what do you want to do, invade Egypt? It's not enough you got up to the Suez Canal? You're such an aggressor? So because of that environment, Israel combining military bridges. So look about it, commercial junk like this. They had these pontoons, which is what you have over here. They even had their own that they made, I described last week, called Gesher Glilim. We'll talk about a little bit that later. So basically they had junk, and they have to cross the Israeli army such as they have, tanks and stuff like that with junk. How do you physically transport them furthermore from the rear to the edge of the canal? In other words, you understand there's a Suez Canal, that's what you got to cross. But the place where the bridges are physically is 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 miles in the rear. It's a war. How does one physically schlep that? Now, if you're in the United States Army, you have unlimited transport, you have endless logistics. But if you're Israel, you don't. You have limited. And a lot of it was already being destroyed in the first several days of the war. So how does one get bridges across a desert? It's not so simple. Israel didn't have these gigundo, trucks that you just pour stuff on the way the United States does. Later, Israel got them from America, but at the time I'm talking about, they didn't have this kind of stuff. So how does one physically transport them from the back and the rear to the edge of the canal, across desert dunes? You have to go through enemy lines. What's to stop the Egyptians from blowing it up? How does one do that? They can't really go across dunes and rocks because you get broken on the way there. And so you need some kind of a road, or you need a path of some sort. They don't have a path. So I guess it will have to be over dunes and rocks. That's going to take a very long time, because there's not much of a point if you take it over a little, cliff or something down and it breaks, right? They have to spend a day or two fixing it if you can. So that doesn't help. So how do we do this? What I'm trying to say is, here's a challenge not for combat soldiers, but for the engineers, as they say, and those type of guys who are absolutely vital people in any kind of a war. Remember, they had the CBs in World War II, and you need them too. It's not all about the people fighting in the front. That, of course, is absolutely vital. It goes without saying. But you also need the people that do the engineering kind of business. And so how do you do that? The other two bridges have to be transported for dozens of miles from the rear, and they can't get through because of traffic jams. Okay? I know it sounds funny, but do you remember in the Patton movie? Okay? Where this is from a movie, but it's based on the real thing. The United States Third Army broke through the German lines in July and August of 1944. They made that famous bash right across the Germans, and then it came to a place, because it's a stupid cross of the roads, they start fighting, and the tanks can go up there until Patton himself shows up and starts punching people out. George C. Scott in the famous movie over there, and here's the commanding general, and he'll stand on there and be a traffic cop. Because that's necessary. Now, I'm simply trying to point out to you that this is a dramatization of something that people take for granted. You need combat soldiers. You need your engineers. You also need your military police, don't you? Get it? You need the guys to make the traffic stop and the traffic start. Okay? And that is what happened. He starts screaming and he put one to the other. And this happened on 2 or 3 separate occasions, which means if you got the commanding general over there, if he's a guy like Patton, he'll shoot you, so okay. But if you don't, so then what makes it happen? Because traffic jams are traffic jams. And even in the military, if you don't have it well organized with your military police, then what happens if this bus doesn't want to get out of the way and that tank doesn't want to get out of the way? And ordinarily it sounds funny, but if it's vital for the prosecution of the war and you're Israel and it's October 1973 and the stupid bridges can't get through because some dumb bus or some other kind of oil truck is in the way and they won't get out of the way, what do you talk to do? Okay? The Israeli general over here who was in charge of getting around was not General Patton, it was General Uri Ben-Ari. He was flying over with an airplane, screaming at a bullhorn, get out of the way, and they didn't listen to him. Okay? General Uri Ben-Ari is one of the Yekis. The Israeli army had a lot of German Jews. He grew up in Nazi Germany. It's a very typical story. And I think his mother or father wasn't Jewish. We grew up in Nazi Germany. And what do you call it? He was kicked out of public school in the ceremony like they used to happen in the 30s. He went to Palestine. And he became Israel's best tank general, and then Ben-Gurion fired him in a famous case in 1957 because one of his subordinates stole a sack of sugar, and he covered for him. And that's because Ben-Gurion at that time wanted to make a moral lesson. They said, unfortunately, I mean, I get it, it makes sense, but not to say that that's the only general that stole stuff. And I say it again, he didn't steal, the guy under him did. But he said like this, you can have a trial or you can resign from the army. But when he resigned from the army, he became a general in the reserves. He's actually was considered Israel's best general. He just never got much of a chance to practice it. He is now number 2 in the South. General Gurney is the head of the whole operation. It was not any good last week, and his number 2 is General Uri Ben-Ari. And so if you want bridges, he has to fly over, and he says, "Ay Gewalt." You look down, imagine you're in one of these little Piper Cubs, and you look down, and you can see traffic jams galore, and what do you do about it? You understand? Now, in a perfect war, Israel, like I say, would have had this plan beforehand. They would have had the military police. You would have had your traffic cops and things like this, and everything would have gone differently. But that's not what happened over there. This is where geography, my friends, becomes important, and we're talking about complicated geography, are we not? Here, Israel wants to cross over here, right where I'm pointing. Excuse me, I said it wrong. Right over there, right above the greater bridge. Great Bitter Lake, right over there is where they want to cross. The Egyptian army is right next door, in what they call over there this Chinese farm, okay? And it's complicated. No bridges can reach their destination by Monday night because of the traffic jams, except a few of these Gilboa pontoons or rafts. And Ariel Sharon says like this, "We're crossing tonight anyway, and damn the risks." You see? The Egyptians are a mile away, less than a mile away, and they can shoot and blow the whole thing up. Well, the old line, it's all about audacity. As Frederick the Great put it, toujours l'audace. Now this is good for a novel and it's good for a movie. Is it good for real life? That is a big question, okay? Now, not for Sharon. He says, let's do it, and don't worry about the rest of it because the results will be worth it. I repeat, the results, or what we hope will be the results, will justify the risk. The Commander-in-Chief, General Bar-Lev, right? He says, he says, okay, we'll try it. But General Ben Adon, the other general, I don't want to confuse you, there was Sharon and Adon. So he's got the hard task of the following. While Sharon is crossing into Egypt secretly, he has to attack the Chinese farm, that area where the Egyptian army is dug in like a hornet's nest, as I told you last week, and try to conquer it or at least keep them away while Israel crosses. So you get what's going on. They're going to try to cross over here and fight these guys so they won't be able to block them as they come in. I don't want to get too complex on you. But it is a bummer and a half. This is not an audacious bypassing of the enemy. That is the task of General Adon, which is what Sharon gets to do. It's a direct assault on a strongly fortified enemy position. See, we're talking about Iwo Jima, okay? And the same thing. This is it, right? Here's where they're going to cross, and here's where the farm is. And the Egyptians were dug in with tanks and machine gun nests and all this kind of business. And to go in there is to walk into the valley of death. There's no question about it. And this poor guy, let's go to the next one. He's the one who has, as I say, the thankless task of storming the Egyptian fortifications. The Israeli soldiers who are going that night into battle know they're going into the valley of death on this last day of Chol HaMoed. When these rabbis, Lubavitchers pass out, everybody takes a Tehillim. It's a very good chance this is the last day. The Israeli army attacks at 5:30, 6 o'clock on Monday night. Right, the Egyptians outnumber them probably 2-1. So here we are. this over here that night into here, okay? And it's a night battle like the movies, full of exploding ammo dumps. It's tanko a tanko, my tank goes against yours, and this one over here. It's a hand-to-hand combat in an indescribable chaos, shooting and exploding everywhere, in which confusion, friend cannot be discerned from foe, and Israel takes very heavy losses. Even Sharon talks about it now.
When we reached the canal, it was a ferocious battle.
It was a terrible night. I think a great night. We lost from my division about 300 killed and now about 1,000 wounded. And all of us, from soldiers to the division commander, we all were fighting there. It was maybe the most terrible night I ever seen.
I think this is the worst battle in Israeli history. As they say, they lost hundreds killed and many hundreds wounded. Is it working? And I won't say there's a funny part to it, but what do you call it? The clashes were so heavy, as you can see next time. Colonel Matan, now he's a colonel at that time, he said that the tanks are going against each other, and he doesn't know, so much smoke, and he pulls up next to another tank, and an Arab guy said like this, he said, "You got a cigarette?" And he said, "Yeah." He throws a grenade. Said, yeah. But I bet you happened the other way around also. So it's really tough, as I can tell you. And, it's all at night, and nothing went according to plan, and it was not successful. Now, Israel did not conquer the position that night at all. The Egyptians have slit trenches everywhere, so you don't know who's in the trenches. Is it Jewish soldiers trying to hide? Is Egyptian soldiers fortified? Again, if you look for moments of humanity, Colonel Reshef, who's the brigade commander, runs by, hears a sound, and he says, "Who's in there? I'm going to shoot." It's Yehudi. He said, "How do I know Yehudi?" He said, "Everybody asks the questions." As schwer zu sein Yid. That's what the guy says. And he said, "I guess you're Jewish," or something else. So, and by the way, the guy who said that was a nephew of Yitzhak Rabin. Okay? Trouble is, the Egyptians are fighting stubbornly. The plan had been to conquer the area by 10 or 11 that night. And this would enable Sharon's troops to bring up the physical bridge and cross the canal with infantry and tanks without them being shot at by the nearby Egyptians. I hope you follow what I said. What happened was something weird, though. During the fierce fighting at this Chinese farm around 9:30 or so, the bridge stuff, or at least some of the big military rafts, were physically hauled to the water's edge, while a half a mile away, terrible fighting is going on. 750 Israeli commanders were able to get through to that spot, meaning they were on buses and a whole big unit's supposed to get through, but only the first unit gets through. When the second unit tries to get through, they get bombed, so they have to pull back. So you have 750. Now, they inflate the rafts. They cross over to the other side, because it's a gap in the Egyptian lines. They blow a hole in the Egyptian ramps there, and they begin to fan out like in a John Wayne movie. And it's 1:30 in the morning before Hoshana Rabbah. Welcome to Yom Tov, as they say. Now this guy, this is Israel's number one commando at that time, Donnie Mann. He's a famous person of yesterday. If you're from a certain generation, you remember him. Old B'nai Kiva boy. Okay, there were a whole bunch of Israeli high officers who started out religious, but by the time their life unfolded, by the way, he was in the Gush Etzion in '48. You understand? No, he was holding the last machine gun nest in Ein Sarim, I think, or something like that. These people grew up fighting with their teeth from early on. I mean, the 48 war, the 56 war, the 67 war, all this kind of stuff. And he was the head of the commandos. And now, so he's their best guy, but he only has 700 men. And the trouble is, the first wave was supposed to be followed by a bunch of other waves, including bridges and tanks. It's supposed to be the beginning of an Israeli penetration. But that was based on the assumption that the Israelis would conquer the Chinese farm and the Egyptians would not be nearby, but it didn't turn out that way, did it? Instead, a single commando unit had crossed the Suez Canal, but it couldn't be followed up. This could be a real disaster. They were waiting on the other side like crazy. Did he get wiped out? Acapulco was it's very famous in Israel. That was the code word that we made it to the other side. But then he said Acapulco, and they said, where are the other tanks? They're not coming right now, Now what do we do? Now fortunately, the Egyptians are not stupid, correct? They were fighting very well. The Egyptians made a big mistake. They do not interpret the Israeli attack correctly as designed to enable an Israeli crossing south of the Chinese farm. Otherwise, they would have sent a whole group a little while away, right? If they realize the battle they're fighting over here, right, or over there, is really designed as a diversion, don't pay attention to the Israelis crossing over here. They would have gone over there. But they thought the main purpose of the attack is to conquer the Chinese farm, so they got their hands totally full with trying to repel the Israeli attack. So they do not pay any attention to the commandos who crossed. That was one good thing. Right? If anything, they think the purpose of the attack is to take over the Chinese farm, and then look what I'm doing. Roll up the entire Egyptian line by going like that, which would be a kind of Napoleonic strategy of a certain type. But that wasn't the plan at all. Israel was not planning to go like that. Israel was planning to go like that and then go up that way. You understand? So in other words, fog of war, as we call it today. Now, accordingly, the Egyptians do launch an offensive against the gap, which they do not, do not launch an offensive against the gap, which would have been deadly. Because then they could have taken over the area half a mile away, and then those other guys on the other side just get stuck, and they get wiped out. Over the course of the night, the bridge broke, naturally. This was that Gesher Galilim that Israel had sort of created, the Lascaux Bridge. Wasn't that great? But some floats were found, and Sharon, at his most audacious, assembles them while the fighting is going like crazy half a mile away. I can't tell you the bizarre nature of this, the surreal. Very close to where you are is going crazy, but right here is a half a mile away, and it's a tiny quiet spot. And so here's Ariel Sharon, away from the fighting, trying to, so like this, bring the floats here, inflate them, put them underwater, get 9 of them together. He assembles them not far from the fighting in the darkness of the night. He has his engineers set them up by 6 o'clock in the morning. That's already dangerous. By the morning, the Egyptians can see. They can see. And then he starts moving tanks across the canal. So these junky things kind of worked. Look what shall I say, hand-to-mouth business this is. They have the original bridge now in the museum in Latrun. This is my next trip, I hope. Okay? By the time I finish this series, the next one we have to do the Yom Kippur War in detail, but only be for nuts. Raise your hand. Now but wait a minute. If some of you know what I'm talking about, I'm sure. In Latrun, they have what they call the Tank Museum. It's like they used to have here in Aberdeen. And I'm sure nobody knows when you see this what it is. And they'll say, this is the Gesher Galilim, or what's that? It saw some serious business in the 73 war, right? It may have been, like I say before, sort of like a Beis Yaakov high school project. That it was, no question about that. But it worked. At the basic, it got the tanks across. I want you to understand, you have 2, you have 3. It's not one. You have several of them, and then you take the first one out and put it in the end. So it is a little bit like a Walt Disney movie, but it's in a crazy way. But that's what happened. As for Dani Mat, the commandos, his men are stuck on the other side, but they have a bunch of Sagers of their own, not the Soviet types, but what they call the LEW anti-tank bazookas. This was Nixon. By this time, the Americans had sent them their top anti-tank weapon, okay? And because the U.S. had by then started to send out the weapons to Israel, if the Egyptians send tanks against these infantry, the Israelis plan to do to them what the Egyptians have done to us. Because they have 500 of these, and these are just as good, if not better, than the Russian ones. And so they can blow up, as you can see over here, they can blow up a Soviet tank the same way. But the Israeli invasion into Egypt proper that I'm talking about, even at this time, has not penetrated the thinking of Sadat and the Egyptian High Command. Okay? Just as the Israelis couldn't get into their head that the Arabs are really going to cross the canal on our side, the Egyptians could not get in their head that the Israelis are going to cross into their side. And even if they do, just like the Israelis said, it's just a raid, a Yom Krav. So the Arabs, the Egyptians also, it's just a little raid, you understand? And so the Israelis, commandos, and the 30 tanks they crossed do a Jeb Stuart, tearing up the Egyptian countryside. I'm talking about military targets, I'm not talking about civilians, in a big raid. So remember Jeb Stuart in the Civil War used to ride behind the lines and blow everything up, burn it all down, and all this kind of stuff, like, and cause havoc. So that's what these guys do. They have 30 tanks, which isn't a lot to me, but I guess it's and they run around. If they see some Egyptian, fortress, they blow it up, or trucks, or this or that and the other. And now becomes a giant clash among the Israeli generals, between Ariel Sharon and the other generals. What do you do next? The famous machlokas among the generals. What do you do next? Now Sharon says like this: we caught him flat-footed. That's clear. Send me as many tanks as you can now, today. Right? And then we'll go around and we'll do Jeb Stuart times 10. We'll really cause havoc on the enemy side, and that will help us win the war. The other generals said that's totally irresponsible. What you got to do, I mean, it's not fair. What if Egypt comes in and pinches off the gap? You have to establish a secure bridgehead, get real bridges, make sure the Egyptians don't counterattack, and capture the place you cross and cut your men off. And Sharon said, no, we're the ones that should be concentrating on cutting them off. Back and forth. Basically, it's a matter of perspective. Sharon sees this as a blitzkrieg. The generals see it as a Dunkirk. See? Sharon said, we're on the other side, we can make a blitzkrieg. The others say, no, you're on the other side, you'd be like the British, cut off. You know, you don't want that to happen. So it's a matter of interpretation, and you couldn't get unanimity. As I indicated, Israel's major asset is the mindset of Sadat and his commanders. Okay? Now, General Shazli, who was their good general, he disagreed. And he called it for what it was. They said they had pinched it off now. And Sadat was so angry, he fired him, thank God. At first, they're not even aware of the IDF presence. And when they become aware of Jeb Stuart, as I said, they shrug it off as some kind of a commando raid. It's not of strategic importance. Golda Meir makes a speech in the Knesset because everybody's so depressed. She can't help it. And she says, Tzahal is now, a lochem b'Africa. And General Elazar commander has a heart attack. He said, shut up. You understand? Get it? He said, Golda, don't be a yenta. It's a famous, right. Okay, what are you doing? But once again, fortunately, now Sadat is the Eli Ze'ev of Egypt. He doesn't get it. He heard Golda say to in Africa, he's she's just like Israel kept discounting all the Egyptian stuff. Now Egypt is discounting the Israeli stuff. I'm telling you, they went into her office and said, what are you doing? Shut up, right? Now, the Russians, on the other hand, because they have the satellites and all that stuff, they're a great power, do comprehend what is happening. They tell Sadat, you're nuts. Israel's invading on your side. They can't get into his head. Because he was so proud, understandably, of how well the Egyptians were doing. And so how successful their plans were until then, that he said, we're in a roll, and we're going to win this, and I'm not going to be, turned aside by little issues. General Adan, not Sharon, the other guy, was tasked now by the generals with building a real bridge. They said, Sharon is irresponsible, you do it right. His men have to do so under continuous fire. And as a result, once they do it, this is all happening in the second week. Then General Adan can move many tanks into Egypt. But the Egyptians nearby have not been destroyed. They're still full of fight, and they will continue to bomb, and drop napalm on the bridges all the way until the end of the war. So it's not true that Israel in the end finally beat them and so on and so forth. There was tough fighting till the last second. It is the Israeli forces who attacked the Chinese farm, those poor guys, on the second day, who draw most of the fire, and therefore they save the IDF guys setting up the bridges nearby and transporting the tanks. So even though they're bombing and napalming the bridge, but the great majority of the Egyptian effort is trying to hold the Chinese fort against the continuous attacks of the IDF against them. So it's really strange. We're 1 week, we just finished Hanukkah. This is exactly what happened like in the original Hanukkah, if you know the history, which you probably don't. And that is that when the Maccabees came to, nobody ever gets this right. They said when the Maccabees, in the middle of the war, having defeated one of the Syrian armies, only in respite, came to Yerushalayim, which was an empty city, had been depopulated, except for the Accra, which was a citadel, which, in my understanding, is where Migdal David is today, right near the Jaffa Gate. And they could shoot down anybody who's wants to get into the base of Mikdash. How could Judah Maccabee come and purify the temple when right nearby is the Greek fortress, well armed, they could shoot at you? And so what it says in the book of Maccabees, he divided the army 50-50, and he said, half the guys, you go and attack and fight them and keep them off our back, and the other half of the army is the ones who carried it to Hanukkah that you celebrate, which is they cleaned up the base of Mikdash, they made the new kalim, they found the oil, they lit it, and they had the celebration of the rededication of Beis Hamikdash. But understand well that when they had the original Hanukkah, they're celebrating Hodel Hashem Ki Tov Yom Chasto, a half a mile away or so is a major battle going on by the other half of the Maccabean army, precisely to keep those guys busy and not bother the people cleaning up the Beis Hamikdash. So you have to give a double bow to those soldiers who got killed fighting the Akra, so that the other half could go and create the Hanukkah. So the same thing happened in 73 war. All these guys fighting in what they call the Chinese farm, and the Egyptian fortifications, are dying and getting maimed and all that, so that half a mile away or so, the other guys can set up the bridge and start to move men and tanks across it. It's a weird situation. And we're talking Hoshana Rabbah, which is a very important date in history. It's my mother's birthday, October 17th, you know. So I'll tell you something. I remember that year a little bit. That was some birthday, right, when it was going on in Israel. For the second day, there is this crazy dissonance. It depends which part of the Israeli army you're in. For the Israelis on the Egyptian side, for the Israelis on the Sinai side, it's another day of death. You go back into Iwo Jima and you fight foot by foot, bunker by bunker, and so forth. It was terrible. For the guys on the Egyptian side, is no casualties. It's Jeb Stewart. You're running around blowing up things. The main thing that they're supposed to blow up is, of course, the SAM missile sites if they can get them. Okay? Because every time you do that, you open a tiny hole. And if an Israeli pilot is good, he can do, like I say, the ballet and go in between the other SAMs and then go back and bomb this one. They make it double the space. They go back and make it triple the space, unless they move new stuff down at the bottom. That was the back and forth, the duet of death that was going on during that war. On that night of Shmini Atzeres, which in Israel is, of course, also Simchas Torah, after constant and very bloody attacks and counterattacks, the Egyptians finally retreat from the Chinese farm. Mainly because, well, no, I won't say mainly, that's ridiculous. Partly because of the Air Force is able to do what I just told you, to operate better because they took away some of the SAM missile sites. An important but very costly Israeli victory. Now, if you're Ariel Sharon, you say it was all waste, and there's a lot of bitterness later on in Israeli history. They didn't need to do that. They should have crossed, like I said, and run up the Egyptian side. We would have saved ourselves hundreds of casualties, and so on and so forth. But anyway, now all kinds of real bridges can be erected with full armor and men crossing. I'm not 100% correct. There was, even after they kicked them out of what they called the Chinese farm, there was another place nearby that the Israelis called Missouri that they could shoot at them from there. So it was not solved until the end of the war. Israel did not win what we would, the kind of total victory you would hope for, and clear that area of any problems. The Arabs are able to shoot at the bridges, and people get killed down to the last day of the war and the last minute of the war. By Shmini Atzeres Simchas Torah, by Thursday, large Israeli forces are finally in Egypt. Over the next 3 days, so it's Yontif, and then the 2 days after Yontif, that's Thursday, Friday, and Saturday of the second week. The war started on Saturday, the first week, and then give it a whole nother week, and then you're almost at the end of the second week. That's what we're talking about. It's a long time they've been fighting. The Egyptians try to contain the Israeli bridgehead. They do make attacks to try to close it off, but they can't. It's stoutly resisted. And finally, the IDF is starting to fan out in Egypt, on the Egypt side. The Israeli army wants to do two thrusts, two attacks. Let's go here. Look what I'm doing. The cross here, one is to go there, and the other one is to go here. If you do this, what I'm pointing to, you cut off the Egyptian Third Army, because they're all here. And as you see, they can't get any land supplies. If you go here, you cut off the Egyptian Second Army. So Sharon, you go north. Adan, you go south. That's what they said over there. If it works. It didn't exactly work that way. By the time I'm talking about, Israel's been fighting for 2 weeks and not 6 days. The soldiers beyond exhausted. We're not built as a country for that kind of business. 2 weeks of solid fighting. Just to put this in perspective, the Americans had the same problem when they had the Marines in World War II. They couldn't go 2 solid weeks of fighting the Japanese. The Marines, who were real tough, fell apart. If you know your history in Tarawa and Saipan and Iwo Jima and Okinawa, people just physically and mentally fell apart. And the Army and the Marines also had to constantly refunnel new men, and it was tough for the United States, who had a gigantic army. Imagine when you're talking about Israel, that they don't have this R&R business, so you take people out of line after a week or so. And so these people are fighting like crazy for two weeks so far, and it's not over. It's not over. Meanwhile, the Russian leader Kosygin visited Cairo for 3 days during this fighting on Hoshana Rabbah, Shmini Atzeres, and Simchas Torah, that second week. Kosygin tells Sadat a number of things. Number one, you guys have fought very well, you're doing great. Number two, you're losing thousands of tanks. We can't replace thousands of tanks. We can replace a couple hundred tanks. You know, the Soviet Union's on a bottomless well. And number three, for your information, the Israeli forces on the Egyptian side are not on a raid. It's not Jeb Stuart. This is a major attack. They're going to cut off your armies. Okay? And he is the one who shows them the pictures, who say, guess what? This is what the Israelis are going to do. As I just showed you, they're going to cut off all your army. You're crazy. So now, this is, as I say, a splash of cold water, only now on Friday of the second week, Simchas Torah. Sadat realizes what's happening, namely that Sharon and Adan and all this are heading south, and soon going to cut off the Egyptian Third Army, as I just showed you. They're going to get down to Suez, and then it's going to be the end of the canal area, and the Egyptians, instead of having an exposed position forward into Israel, will be cut off, and they'll have to surrender. If that army surrenders, it'll be a catastrophe, obviously, for Sadat, which will undo everything he gained so far. You all understand that, right? That would be the opposite of what they planned on. And of course, that's Israel's goal. So Golda Meir is salivating. He said, can we pull this off? Because that's the only way that would sort of bring a closure to everything that happened now. We had 2 hard weeks, but in the end, imagine the pictures. Like the Japanese got to surrender in Singapore. You see 70,000, 80,000 Egyptians, laying down their arms. It would have been an unbelievable downer for Egypt, unbelievable upper for Israel. So that's what they really want, which for understandable reasons. General Shazli, even though he's kicked out, he says, let me tell you something. You better bring back the forces from the other side to fight the Israelis. Pull the Third Army or whoever, bring tank units and junk like that back into Egypt, because they're going to run down and blow up the whole country. Sadat said, no, if I start pulling soldiers back into Egypt, that'll crush the morale. In war, as we know, the psychology is extremely important. The Arabs were justifiably on a roll. They're fighting great. Now you're going to tell them pull back? They're not going to understand the sophisticated strategy. We cannot do it. You understand? Shazli said, if you think that'll kill morale, what's going to happen when Israel pulls a Napoleon on you and the whole army falls apart? You understand? Maybe you better start. Sadat then says like this, I hate to say it, that's a good point. Maybe, for the first time, we should start thinking about a ceasefire. Okay? Okay, my friends, hold that thought. So far, I've taken you down one road, and that's the road of combat events, okay, in the north and the south. Because we reached a turning point, I have to take you now on a different road, and that is the arena of international diplomacy and superpower rivalry, because the Yom Kippur War is not happening in an international vacuum, very far from it. As we've seen, tried to explain to you early this year, by October of 1973, Richard Nixon was very angry at the intransigence of Golda Meir on peace and withdrawals. Because Israel kept saying, mañana, and they didn't want to actually give anything up, and Nixon is screaming in his office, the Israelis, the Jews, this and that and the other, they're not being reasonable, we give them everything, they don't do anything for us. In spite of this, Nixon was emotionally committed to Israel's security. But although he wouldn't know it based on his anti-Semitic remarks that he sank at the same time that we get on the Watergate tapes, it's a strange story. At the same week that I'm talking about of the Yom Kippur War, he's angry because the Jews, as he sees it, are working on the Soviet Jewry business and therefore they're undermining the Dayton. Look at this. That's okay. The only thing left is Kissinger says you're absolutely. Kissinger says you're absolutely right. I agree with you. That's how it works. Now, that's the Nixon that they say, oh, I hear that. What do you want? On to submit. When the war broke out on Saturday at 2 in the afternoon, because that's when the Egyptians and the Syrians attacked, right? On Yom Kippur, on Shabbos, at 2 in the afternoon, they're 7 hours behind in America, in Washington. Agreed? So if the war started at 2, it means by American time it started, 6 in the morning or so. Kissinger had been told by Golda Meir earlier of the impending Arab attack later that day. So that means that Golda Meir talked to Kissinger in the morning. That means the middle of the night in America. Agreed? Or didn't, the ambassador. Kissinger asked her not to attack first, because then we won't be in a position to help you. And Golda Meir agreed. We've discussed that. So I want you to get the timeline over here. All this was happening Friday night, Saturday, just before the war broke out, American time. For all of Saturday and Sunday and Monday in America, the Israelis were shooting the bull. They're winning. It's going great. Nixon was chortling. He said, now we'll make the Russians look bad, okay? See, the Russians were stupid enough to stick the Arabs on the Israelis, and Israel's going to do to them another six-day war, and America's allies will look good. Okay, fine. The Israelis, nevertheless, even though they say they're winning, they say we immediately ask for American weapons because we're using them up. Kissinger, now remember, they think Israel's winning. Kissinger said we can't really help during the war. Once the war is over, Nixon is committed to making up all the phantoms that were shot down. Kissinger said, it's not me, it's not what I want. What can I do? It's the Defense Department, they won't let it happen. So you start this business where everybody lies. It's his fault, it's his fault, it's his fault. Is it true? Like I'm doing now. Some say yeah, some say no. There's evidence this way, evidence that way. Late Monday night, so again, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, American time. Late Monday night, Israel sends a new message. Actually, we're not winning. Actually, we're getting busted. Actually, we're fighting like crazy on 2 fronts, and the last 3 days we have lost hundreds of tanks and planes, which is a shock in America. Actually, our situation is desperate. This was sent from Israel Tuesday morning, which of course was 7 hours earlier, late Monday night in America. Agreed? In the middle of the night. In addition, by the way, we're totally running out of ammunition of all kinds, and so, as the Israeli ambassador Simcha Dinitz pleads back and forth and bugs them again and again, we need ammo, artillery, tanks, fighter planes, and we need them now, pronto. Dinitz was Golda Meir's personal secretary. He had a degree in international relations from Georgetown University. He had a bachelor from University of Cincinnati. He understands America. At least one thinks he understands America. And he's saying, no. Okay? Now, mind you, the Arabs are in the same predicament. They're spending weapons like crazy also. Agreed? What's going on the Syrian front? What's going on the Egyptian front? Even if they're winning, they're shooting off zillion rounds, and they're losing plenty of tanks and planes and stuff like that on their own, which have to be made up. When Kissinger gets the message now that Israel's desperate, he's not certain what to do. He doesn't want the USA to appear, I'm talking about Kissinger now, he doesn't want the USA to appear to be involving itself publicly and directly in the war. Kissinger, so that's what he recommends, a low profile. And Kissinger passes the message to Nixon, and Nixon says, send them what we can, the maximum, and send it now. Okay? So this is what? Monday night, Tuesday morning in America, shortly after the war began. Saturday, Sunday, Monday, now we're talking Tuesday morning, when they have this exchange with Nixon. At that point, the State Department and the Defense Department do a bureaucratic thing. In other words, you kill the idea by inertia. I know nobody here works for the federal government, and nobody here has any idea what I'm talking about, okay? We don't know. We don't have enough weapons. They're not in the right places. They're actually not in good shape. You'd be shocked to see what bad shape they're in. The planes don't really work. The usual baloney. Now, here we come, looking back at the perspective of almost a half century, 45 years ago, at providential events. Weird facts that are just lend a certain crazy flavor to the story because here we Richard Nixon, of all people, just immediately before the Yom Kippur War, placed in the two top spots of the United States government two Jews. Okay? Two very different Jews, but two Jews. In July 73, that's July, August, September, October, shortly before the Yom Kippur War, he puts in Defense Department James Schlesinger. Okay? And September, a few weeks before the Yom Kippur War, he puts Kissinger as Secretary of State. This is actually remarkable. It's not Truman, it's not Kennedy, it's not Obama, it's Richard Nixon. But two Jews. Now, if you don't see a hand behind the hand in all this, you're blind. Okay? Now, let me put it this way. There's a big difference. Schlesinger is Mamash Meshumad. Okay? He converted to Lutheran back in 1950. Let's get straight up here. Which is weird, because to convert to Christianity in post-war America, when it wasn't necessary anymore to get ahead, to speak some serious psychological issues vis-a-vis Judaism in Israel. James Schlesinger is a New York Manhattan Jew. That's from the ultra-reformed variety. That's what it was. His parents were, way past Judaism themselves. And he just took the next logical step. He's a New York guy, went to Horace Mann, went to Harvard, all that stuff. And when the war begins, it's not 100% clear, but you get the impression Schlesinger is not so bothered by Israel's peril. Kissinger has a lot of faults, and we're going to go into that to some degree next week, I hope. But he is bothered by Israel's peril. Moreover, the number two guy in the Defense Department was William Clements. If you know, he later was a governor. He was the head of the oil companies. So he's very tight with the Arabs, especially Saudi Arabia. And he is predicting if you help Israel, the gas will go up, which happened. Kissinger is the artful dodger, although I think it did matter to him what's happening in Israel, but the lies are so abundant, and everybody covers themselves in post-war writings, it's not easy to get at what really happened. Already by Sunday, meaning Saturday, Sunday, the first day of the war, by Sunday, ammunition was being used up in crazy quantities by both sides. Because what was happening on Sunday? He had these giant battles in the Suez Canal, and you had these huge battles in the northern and southern half of the Golan, like I described to you before, these crazy. So from the point of view of shells and weapons and things like that, it goes in very fast amounts. The Russians begin sending already on the second day of the war significant amounts, or the third day. I like this. The USSR sends to Syria all the tanks in the Hungarian army. Now you laugh, they're all T-55, T-62 tanks, they're good tanks. But there's not much of a chance of Hungary being invaded during Yom Kippur of 1973, of Sukkot either. So the Russians don't want to take their own tanks, so they take from the satellite countries, you understand? Okay, fine. Nixon and Kissinger agreed to send stuff, but they want to do it quietly. The Pentagon is nervous. We're talking here the fourth day of the war, when Israel's really in bad shape. As the supply situation gets worse and worse over the course of the week, Shabbos, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, fighting on two fronts, Ambassador Dinitz bombards Kissinger and the White House. We need more, and we need it now. Dinitz, who's not stupid, also goes to the Congress. At that time, it's not the same Congress as today. You had different cast of characters, okay? Very pro-Israel, right? I think you'll perhaps remember some of those names. Some of you are too young, you won't, but you take it from me, it was a pro-Israel Congress. Nixon, during this very week, is swirling in the Watergate, which is hard enough. In the middle of the Yom Kippur War, that's when he fired Archibald Cox. You all remember that? What they called the Saturday Night Massacre. And then Elliot Richardson resigned, and this one resigned, that one, and he caught it in the media and all that. And he's not Trump to say, I'm not gurus to media. Nixon was totally gurus to media. And so you had a major crisis over here, and he's nevertheless, Nixon, who loved crises, he wrote a book called Six Crises, he struggles to concentrate and hold cup in the war. Right? This is, as I say over here, let's go to the next one. This is a difficult moment in Richard Nixon's presidency because you have Watergate and a Middle Eastern war. How do you keep your head holding in both? Now, he writes, and we have these things. He writes on the memos to himself. That's what he used to do. He was a lawyer, so he had the yellow pads. So he said like this, what's going to be our policy? Okay? First of all, Israel cannot go under, in principle. which is interesting. Many years later, I think he's surprised, a year before he died, Nixon did this big interview with Ted Koppel, who was a jerk and a half, and listen to this.
You make the observation in your book, and you say that you have said it many times when you were president of the United States, that no president is ever going to desert Israel, right?
Correct. I put it more bluntly. I said, as I told congressional leaders during the 1973 Yom Kippur War, no American president will let Israel go down the tube.
All right.
Democrat or Republican, it's not an issue.
That is stated fairly categorically, and yet in your book you make it clear at the same time that Israel really is not of any enormous strategic value to the United States anymore.
That's correct.
So why then would the United States continue to burden itself with huge loans, in some cases outright grants, to the Israelis, jeopardize possibly young American fighting men, when there is no strategic value involved, or little strategic
Because the
value?
United States is concerned by more than strategic values. That's maybe a weakness, but it's the way we are. And there are moral issues involved here. We don't have an alliance with Israel. As you know, they're not an ally of the United States in the technical sense. But we have a bond to Israel that's much stronger. It's a moral commitment. A moral commitment because of what happened during the Holocaust, and a moral commitment because it is a democracy, the only democracy in that area. And under the circumstances, that is why American presidents and the American people in the future will support all out the survival of Israel if it's attacked.
You've always been a very tough, pragmatic man. And I just wonder if you were the president of Israel and you heard Richard Nixon talking that way, or for that matter, heard any sitting American president talk that way, and say, but there's really no strategic value anymore, how much faith would you place in that kind of a moral commitment if push really came to shove?
If I were the president of Israel, I put a great deal of faith in it because of the track record of the United States, and also because he would know that that is the way the American people are. There is no doubt whatever of our commitment to Israel.
Although,
Can you believe that? Now I'm going to tell you something. I want to shoot Ted Koppel. You see? Now you tell me this is why history is not for dummies. What I mean by that is, so I'm asking you a question. Is Nixon an anti-Semite? Now explain the tapes. Explain this. It's complicated. That's like if I ask you, are you a good person? Are you a bad person? Well, let's put it this way. Is the person sitting next to you a good person? A good person or a bad person? It's complicated. You understand? It's complicated. But the Rebbeinu Shalom has a funny sense of humor. That's all I can say, because I'm sure, this is what I'm sure. When the Arabs started the war, I don't think they expected this. You understand? I don't think they expected this. So Nixon writes himself a note, and first of all, Israel cannot be allowed to go under in principle. Second, Israel, he writes, is America's protege in the Cold War. If Israel loses to Russia's protege, it's bad for American foreign policy. It's bad enough that South Vietnam is in the process of going under, which sends a message around the world that if you're a friend of America, you can be destroyed. We don't want another South Vietnam. Thirdly, and here's Nixon, I told you a minute ago, it's complicated. It goes like this, right? Nixon wants to be in a position of having helped Israel so that Israel will not be able to decline to accept his peace proposals. Okay? Well, look what he says. Look at this. This is, I think, in the David Frost interview or something. He said, we didn't put it to the Israelis on the spot where we were trying to threaten them because they won't take it. I mean, no, they'll never take it, and we wouldn't put them in that spot. What we did do was reason with them, okay? But to reason with them in a way, if I could call like the Godfather, gave an offer they couldn't refuse. It's absolutely true. Let me tell you something. If I gave you $1 million and I got you with this, I got you out of jail, I helped you with this, I got you that, I helped your kids and all the rest of it, and I ask you for a favor, are you in a position to refuse? No. You understand? Now, by the way, many countries are. And the United States has had that many times. And they bit the hand but that's why guys like Trump can say, we're angry, they can do it. I'll just give you one example that jumps to mind. We bailed out Kuwait, and then they gave all the contracts to rebuild the country to Germany and to France. Do you remember that? How can you do that? I just did it for you. So there is concept, as a famous Austrian statesman said in 1849, Austria will astonish the world with its ingratitude. But you want to know something? That means don't count on me in the future. You can do that to me once. Israel is in for a long-term relationship. And so if I helped you in the way I just described, as he put over here, he says, it's an offer you can't refuse. We're giving you the money, we're giving you the weapons, we're saving you, we're saving all the rest of it, and now we're asking you to do something. How can you say no? All right? The offer basically was, the United States will continue to stand by you. We have demonstrated they will come to your aid with arms if you come under attack. And third, on your side, will take such great risks, not only the airlift, but an alert, as we'll talk about next week. He almost went to World War III, to say you have to listen to us, at least in being reasonable and talking to your potential enemies. So it's a calculated business. Now, is Nixon being operated by, shall we say, Machiavellian policies, by idealistic policies, by emotional policies? It's like you and me. It's a mixture of everything, isn't it? That's why history, if you study it seriously, is so fascinating. Because all of us are a cholent of all kind of different emotions. At least if you're a person of substance. There are obviously many political leaders who are dunderheads, and there's nothing to them, and all you see is what's there. You get it? Tochel kapara. Ain't nothing on the outside, ain't nothing on the inside. But the serious players are very complex characters. The great people, the great men and women of history are complex individuals, and you can't, you can do whatever you want, but if you want to be honest about it, you can't give me a unilinear, kind of a description and expect me to take it seriously. So I run into people all the time who say Nixon this and that, and Trump this and that, and Obama that and this, and Clinton that and this, and it's just water off my back because they don't know what they're talking about. They're taking a very dumb, superficial, unilinear, as I call it, one color, either black or white view of something that isn't like that. So I tell it to you, so from now on, when you read the paper or you see the press, use your head a little bit. Don't just rely on what they're saying, because the reality is much more complex than this. Okay, back to business. The Pentagon haggling continues. Now remember, Nixon said already by Tuesday morning, Israel time, Tuesday morning American time, send them the weapons, just you don't have to do it in a giant way. The Pentagon haggles over Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. In other words, nothing happens on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. Very little is going to Israel. The Pentagon even insists that if Israel sends an El Al plane and they put on weapons, they should paint off the Magen David. So it shouldn't look, God forbid, like America is doing anything of here. Schlesinger will not even take the phone call of Dinitz because, I'll tell you why, because the Israeli military attaché, you won't find this in the books, the Israeli military attaché was a Motagor, later was the chief of the army. And he was an idiot in some ways, and very smart in other ways, like I told you before. And he goes to Schlesinger and says, just give me the green light. I'll take care of the Congress. I get it, but you don't talk like that to a Secretary of Defense. Abyssal seichel, please. But Jews don't have seichel. So it was a rough situation. The situation in Israel is getting worse and worse as far as the neshek, as far as the weapons are concerned. By this time, now what am I talking about? The end of the week. It's been Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Where's Israel holding weapons-wise, ammunition-wise, by Friday of that week, with all the fighting in the north that we described, and the terrible stuff going on in the south? The Egyptians in the south, the IDF was, by Friday, was stymied. The Egyptians had not launched that counterattack that they did a weekend, which was good for Israel, because Israel was able to destroy their tanks. They were still in that hedgehog position in which every time Israel tried to do something, Israel got a bloody nose. Ahead of Israel, I'm talking about that first Friday of the war, ahead of them were costly battles to try to cross the canal, fight on the other side. Ahead of them were the battles with the Chinese farm, battles that would spend lives and weapons and ammo prodigiously. Simcha Dinitz, the ambassador, keeps pounding all the time, calling over and over again Nixon and calling Kissinger. He said, the Russians are pouring it on. You tell me about détente. They're making a mockery of détente by pouring in thousands of tons of tanks and everything for the Arabs. And that still the Pentagon stalls, because that's the bureaucracy if they want to. The bureaucratic paper flow simply opposes a big American airlift. I'm talking about the second level, which the stuff really happens, and the third level, the assistant secretary, the deputy assistant secretary, the guys that got to make it all work. That is how the bureaucracy usually kills orders it doesn't like. And it works effectively much of the time. After all, the president isn't the expert. The experts are the experts. The generals know what they can do and what they can't do. And the generals only tell Nixon, it doesn't work, we don't have the ammunition in my place, the planes aren't there, we don't have planes to land, and so, give 100 reasons, each one of which is true. Now, any other president would say like this, I'm sorry, my hands are tied, the experts tell me it can't be done. Here we have another providential phenomenon in my way of thinking. If you know anything, of all the presidents, none of them had the utter contempt for the federal bureaucracy that Richard Nixon had. That's a major feature of who he was. It's very interesting. He hated and held in contempt the State Department, the CIA, the Defense Department, all the rest of it. He thought that they're all full of baloney. He had formed his opinion over many years. It mainly had to do, if you want to be a psychologist, mainly had to do with the fact that he and his wife almost got killed in South America back in the late 50s when they landed in a country and the CIA said, everything's fine. You understand? And the defense said, everything, no problem. Here, take a look at this. This is from yesteryear.
On another continent, 4,650
1958.
Venezuela, the news concerns the Vice President of the United States and his wife, arriving by plane at Caracas to conclude a tour of South America. Apparently unprepared by warnings of a minority, but strongly resentful anti-American sentiment, Mr. Nixon pursues the whirlwind schedule which typified his eight-nation Latin American tour. Hostility rears its vilifying head. The Vice President of a good neighbor is lampooned. Brewing is the most violent attack ever perpetrated on a high American official while on foreign soil. The Vice President's car is leading the motorcade en route to a replaying ceremony. The traffic is heavy and the motorcade forced to slow down. Then begins the barrage, rock, hay, debris. Several in the party are injured as both the Vice President and Mrs. Nixon's cars are pelted and spat upon. Mute evidence of the attack.
He never got over this, right? As you can understand, his wife was almost hurt and all this kind of stuff. He never got over this. Now, you have to be pretty religious to say the reporter show organized in 1958. Nixon should get all smashed up. Say that 15 years later, you understand? But you never know. Anyway, so he basically, if you tell, of all the presidents, you say that the Pentagon says it doesn't work. The CIA says yes. They're all full of baloney. They'll all be fired. As a matter of fact, that's exactly why Richard Nixon created Kissinger as the total doorkeeper. If you know anything about Nixon's years, there wasn't a CIA briefing. Every president gets briefed by the CIA every morning. Nixon refused that. He said, tell everything to Kissinger. If it's important, he'll tell me. The Defense Department, the State Department wanted to talk to Nixon all the time. He said, don't talk to me, talk to Kissinger. And believe me, Kissinger's job also depended on him saying, the bureaucracy is full of baloney, they're lying to you again. And if you listen to the Watergate tapes, the White House tapes all the time, they're always bashing, the State Department got it wrong in Cambodia, the CIA doesn't know what's going on in Vietnam, the Defense Department screwed it up again, they're all no good, and so on and so forth. This was very good. This is very good for Israel if it's October 1973. So my point is that the story reaches a climax on Shabbos Chol Hamoed. Again, the story started on Saturday, Yom Kippur. By the next Saturday is Shabbos Chol Hamoed. Agreed? Nixon had it up to here. Dinitz and Golda Meir are resending increasingly desperate pleas. Israel is winning in the north, they say, but the great price in casualties and equipment and ammo. In the south, the situation is still a bummer. Shabbos, the first Shabbos after Yom Kippur. Maybe Israel breaks through, they say, and cross the canal, maybe not. Here in the south, the casualty and attrition rate, they say, is out of this world. And by the way, Mr. President, the Russians are conducting a Jagundo airlift on their side, which they were doing, thousands of tons. So Nixon, like I said, had up to here, and plus the Watergate and all the rest of it. Plus he was drinking, and so that's a good thing here. So he says Nixon has a full NSC, National Security Council meeting on Shabbos morning, and he blows a gut. He said, "I know you're all stalling. I know what you're doing. I'm the president, and I'm telling you what my policy is. Not your policy. I don't care about your policy. I'm the president. Guess what? My policy is the policy of the United States government. And whoever doesn't follow my orders, resign today. And it's my policy to totally resupply Israel. I don't care what you guys think. You understand?" And he turns to General Brown, who's the chairman of the Chiefs of Staff, and he says, "Look, you've had days and days to do it. What is the problem?" He says. What's going on with you? Now, Schlesinger, the Secretary of Defense, says, let's send a few planes with stuff, not too high profile. It's already Saturday, a week after Yom Kippur, and he's still doing the same thing. Nixon blows up. A great power does not hide. You don't understand anything. We're going to be blamed for 3 planes or for 300. Now, I want this done now. Al Haig is my chief of staff over here. He's going to see that this is done as I wish it. Or Haig will fire you, and I'll get secretaries and generals who will do what I want. So he has like a whole scene over there. And Kissinger was waiting for this, He said, by the way, here's Golda Meir's shopping list, because he had it. And Nick said, double it, That's it. I'm serious. He said, send everything we have, send them all the new weapons, except for the laser-guided bomb. That was the newest technology they were using in Vietnam. So that now, but everything else, so, the tanks, the bombs, the plane, all they're sending now. By the time this is over, the bureaucracy is shaken. And so they say, okay, and they swing into action, as the United States military can do in an unbelievable way when they put their mind to it. If you give them the orders and they do it, the U.S. military is amazing. I think we know this. The gigantic American cargo planes will fly to Israel. You can't fly directly with all that stuff. They'll fly to the Azores, which is the islands near Portugal in the Atlantic, refuel, because the Europeans won't let them land over there. They will not let the planes for Israel land in the American air bases in Germany, for example. Now, if it was Trump, he's like this, we're paying you to have the planes. But Nixon's like this, I ain't got no time for this. Portugal will let us in, that'll do. So they fly to Portugal, they refuel. We're talking about huge planes over here. And then fly to Ben Gurion Airport, B'chayzer Khalila, and go back the same way. And so if you're in the Azores in October of 1973, it turns into Grand Central Station, doesn't it? Which means the United States, I just want you to understand a little bit, and I'm very far from an expert in this kind of business, a little bit of what this means in terms of the U.S. military. They fly in like 1,000 people to set up the airport in the Azores to handle the crazy amount of traffic that's going to come through. They sleep in churches, they set up like bases for the food, and then just the planes to get them on there. Where do you get the fuel over there? Giant tankers from the Navy have to be rerouted and sent immediately to the Azores. It's a huge logistics operation, but I'll say it again. The United States, when it wants to, when it makes up its mind, can beat anybody on this. That's a good thing. If they want to, right? So here are the orders right from the top. And he said, I want to pull out all the stops, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do this right. And so, as you see over here, this is called Operation Nickel. Let's go back one. This is called Nickel Grass. The planes are going to have to fly across the Mediterranean. Who says that the Egyptians or the Syrians or maybe the Russians won't shoot them down? They fly over the Mediterranean. Nixon puts the 6th Fleet in the Mediterranean, and the American airplanes off the aircraft carriers are escorting the planes going back and forth to Israel. So look at the gigantic nature of the logistics that we're talking, and tell me how much money this costs. Okay, Nixon was saying like this: we're a great power, and we're going to flex our muscles. That's what we're going to do. That's my job. That's my policy. We're going to do this, right? We can do what no other country in the world can do, and we're going to do it. The meeting of this National Security Council took place around noon on Saturday afternoon, as I just told you. By late Sunday afternoon, early in the evening, around 6 o'clock on Sunday afternoon, 6:30 by Israel time, 6:30 p.m., so it's already getting dark in October, the first giant Taekwondo airplanes start to land in Israel. As emotional, go to the next one. As you see, an emotional Golda Meir is standing there to greet the pilots and give them some reception. You can imagine, all the Israelis were crying, which is perfectly understandable. And these guys, right, they're not Jewish. And they said, we never got this in our life. You know what I mean? They got off the plane. It was like amazing. Because for Israel, it was at the last minute, so to speak. You understand? There will be almost 600 planes involved in this. It's a gigantic operation. I want you to think of the logistics involved, as I just said before. And here, take a look at this. The U.S. made this. And here you see these giant cargo things that the Israelis are setting up to take in the ammunition and whatever other supplies are being on there. And then they're transporting them off the planes. And then Israel has to put them in trucks and zoom them to the front line, don't they? Okay? Zoom to the front line. So let's put it this way. This is quite an operation. And as you can see, this is just the beginning, I guess, at the airport. The Ludo Airport, of course, is closed down. It's all for the military. Had to be, because they're the only ones that have the runways for this kind of business. And all right, you get the general picture. The Russians are no joke. The Russians send 8,000 tons of supplies to each of the, not 8,000 pounds, 8,000 tons of supplies to the Arabs. Nixon says 25,000. 3 times as much. Okay? 25,000. So basically, let's go to the next one. So Nixon basically said, I'll raise you, you know. Now, well, this is what he was doing, is flexing the muscles. You do airlift, I'll show you an airlift. You understand? If, like I said before, if you do it, you do it. The United States will send, in addition to these giant planes that are landing in Israel and dropping off the stuff and going back for a second round, Nixon also sends 100 warplanes for Israel to use, including 36 Phantoms, 60 Skyhawks, and a bunch of these Gigundo, Hercules cargo planes, which therefore means like this. A plane will land in Israel with like 30 tanks on. I don't know how many they hold. It's crazy that planes can hold this much. 30 tanks on the plane, and then the American pilots will get out, and the Israeli pilots will go in and fly that plane to the Sinai. So they'll actually get off the ramp in the Sinai and go right into the battle. Okay? Because, like I said before, the U.S. military, if they want to get efficient, they can get efficient. Okay? And basically, we're talking over here Nixon's finest hour, as I said it. This is an article that appeared not long ago in a commentary magazine, a piece of it. Alexander Haig was the chief of staff at that time. Said as soon as the scope and the pattern of the Israeli battle losses emerged, Nixon ordered all destroyed equipment be made up out of U.S. stockpiles using the very best weapons America possessed. Whatever it takes, he told Kissinger, to save Israel. And it was Nixon who did it, said Leonard Garment. Leonard Garment was Jewish. That was Nixon's White House counsel, his former law partner. I was there as the bickering was between the State and Defense Department. He just ordered Kissinger, get your rear end out of there and tell these people to move. When Schlesinger, this is Al Haig talking, when Schlesinger initially wanted to send 3 transports to Israel because he feared anything more would alarm the Arabs and the Soviets, Nixon said, we're going to get blamed for 3, like for 300 to get him in the air right now. Haig, in his memoir, Inner Circles, wrote that Nixon, frustrated with the initial delays in implementing the airlift and aware that the Soviets had begun airlifting supplies to Egypt and Syria, summoned Kissinger on Shabbos, as I told you, and banished all excuses. The president asked him for a precise accounting of Israel's needs, and Kissinger read out from an itemized list, and Nixon said, double it. Now get out of here and get the job done. And later informed of another delay because of disagreements over the type of plane to be used in the airlift, right? And then says Nixon counted at Kissinger, he said, whatever, use every one of them they have and tell them to send everything that can fly. He acted despite the threats of reprisal by Arab oil producers. Indeed, the day after he asked for $2.2 billion, Saudi Arabia announced the embargo of oil, not to mention Europe's overwhelming opposition. Just like today, the Europeans were totally opposed to the United States policy. He did not care. So this is called the finest hour, as far as I'm concerned. Now, I know there are all kind of people out here in the audience, but it doesn't matter. Now the question, okay? Now, if you ask me the question, where exactly was Kissinger over here, it's not clear. Yesh darshan l'shvach, v'yesh darshan l'ganai, you know? So you can argue both ways. You can say that Kissinger was pushing this from day one, as he says he did. You can say that really he was not. We'll talk about more. But in the time I have left over, I can only tell you that Sadat was flabbergasted at the massive American airlift, which grows day by day. You know, they start reporting them. The Americans are flying in this, and then this, and then that, and another 10 planes, and another 10 planes, and another 10 planes, and he's freaking out. Together with the Israeli offensive, it makes Sadat start to consider his course of action. We're talking about the second week of the war, okay? So the planes start landing right here on the 14th, which is the Chol Moed Sukkos. This is when Nixon had that big meeting where he screamed at everybody. This is when the planes start landing in Israel at 6:30 in the evening. So we're talking about this week and the following week. And as I told you before, 25,000 tons are coming in. If not for the American airlift, let's put it this way, Israel would be on the ropes in a serious way. The Israeli army could not really hold the Sinai without the airlift. Didn't have it. Didn't have the weapons. Even when the Israelis crossed into Africa, Sadat was not really worried about Israel conquering Egypt. All he had to do was fight stubbornly. He was absolutely right about that. And the IDF will be eroded. And of course, Stalin is being resupplied by Russia. So Stalin simply said like this. Sadat said, let me do a Stalin. What did Stalin say? Fight every inch of the way. Isn't that what he did in Russia when Hitler invaded? Just fight every farmhouse and every road. You know that. Turn the whole place into Stalingrad. The Egyptians could easily do it, and Israel could not handle that. You say they get to Cairo, like Ariel Sharon said, we're going to get to Cairo. Okay, and what happens when you get to Cairo? I want to hear this. He said, how are you going to get through street by street where everybody's shooting at you with who knows what? Just tell me what exactly is the plan. You understand? It sounds good, but what's exactly the plan? Moreover, the war in the north could reopen at any moment. I don't think people are aware of this. During the second week, now I described to you before, I hope you remember, that Israel beat the Syrians by the end of the first week, beginning of the second week. Yes and no. During that second week, Syria was getting totally resupplied. Syria now is awash in Iraqi divisions. The Iraqis sent hundreds of thousands of men there. You hear what I said? Division after division of Iraqis. Syria plans to use the second week to prepare a massive offensive for the third week that will drive the IDF out of Syria and hopefully conquer the Golan Heights good and proper this time. It's not what you think that Israel had so busted the Syrians that they were on the run, you know. This is no idle threat. Remember, by the second week, the bulk of the Israeli army is not in the north anymore. It's on the southern front, where it's being bloodied at places like the Chinese farm and elsewhere. Remember, nowhere do the Egyptians cut and run. It's not the Six-Day War, as I told you before. And so this is so complicated. Oh, what a tangled web we weave when we practice to deceive. It's so complicated. Oy. This is where things stand during that second week of the war. This tour that I just gave you of the complicated, I'm coming to the end, of the complicated supply and strategic side of the war provides the background for the final stages of the war as it entered its third and final week. The Yom Kippur War lasted from Yom Kippur until a week after Sukkot, which is a long time. And it was no blitzkrieg. Bob Hope was giving a pro-Israel, you know what I mean, telethon or something like in the West Coast. He said, oh, it's not a blitzkrieg, it's a blitzkrieg. You know what I mean? Okay. It's a good joke. It would have been a good joke in the 67 war. It was not a joke in the 73 war. I mean, he meant well, yeah. It's not a joke for the 73 war. Instead, there will be very tough fighting down to the very end. The IDF would succeed in implementing parts of that Napoleonic strategy that I told you about, where they'll go around, as you can see over here, and cut off the Third Army. Thus, this will be the part that the Israelis will take over. You understand? Part of it. However, Israel will learn that under the rules of the game, just as the USA would not let Israel be crushed, the USSR would not let Egypt be crushed. As these realities sunk into the heads of the leaders of Israel and Egypt, not Syria, it didn't sink in their heads, but as these realities sunk in the heads of the leaders of Israel and Egypt, the point of the war began to be questioned. International power politics, international diplomacy began to kick in. It was about to become the moment of Mr. Diplomacy. But that is something we'll do next time. Stay tuned. Good night.